Well, I wanted to do a video. I always say that now, kind of to justify what I'm doing. Uh, I have a channel, a certain number of subscribers, not very many. Some have expressed gratitude at something I may have said in a video that may have helped them, and I enjoy doing it pretty much. Sometimes I do these out of a sense of kind of obligation or to contribute something. As a born teacher, I think I feel a little bit frustrated that I don't have the opportunity to teach as much as I might, even though if I were more active in seeking out, even voluntary, of course, teaching opportunities. But since some people do know me in certain organizations in the church, and apparently, I don't know whether they think I'm too difficult to understand or what it is, I don't get too many invitations. I have a former student who's working on his doctorate of ministry at the university where I taught and was in charge of the Doctor of Ministry program, who is from the Middle East and has uh, I suppose, a poetic and an imagination, etc., probing, exploratory mind. And he and I get into some really interesting conversations, somewhat outside the box, regarding the Bible and regarding questions that we can come up with. And I find that even though I'm only maybe 10 or 15 years older than he is, the fact that I have had so many years of study and experience means that I can, contribute or convince even sometimes people about things based on additional information. The more information one has, the more one can understand things. The bigger the framework, it's like a database. I find that analogies between computing, for example, the hard drive that I speak about, that we're hardwired for belief, and we can believe anything depending on what kind of software has been inputted, or even viruses can creep in and then things don't work well. We have a lot of cases of people that don't work well in their heads, and in fact, they can turn to violence that way. And so, and one of the great memories of my readings about Vatican II is that most of the bishops, as most everyone in the church in the earlier part of the 20th century, were trained with theology manuals. In other words, condensations of primary sources, condensation, selections, like a reader's digest for theological study. Makes it a lot simpler. It's all there. It's all very clear. But it could all be very limited as far as the slice of church life or theological learning that you are presenting. So it was a very narrow education, more of an indoctrination, which still applies to the media today. You have things filtered through a media or a medium, and you don't realize that you are really just consuming what some people, especially way up there, have put together for specific purposes, propaganda, whatever. I know a person that I still consider to be holy, very naive, very uneducated, but very good person. And she would pretend basically that she doesn't listen to the news. She listens to news blurbs from a very Catholic, devout, conservative, worldwide radio network. Well, this is not objective news. This is the very particularistic tendency of a certain number of people in the church who have a very narrow and very, I think, poor agenda. And she thinks she's not getting into politics, but she's consuming political ideas without even knowing it. Uh, but that's not really the topic that I want to talk about today. Today, I want to talk about some nice things. This is Holy Saturday, and the picture that you see is of the Colosseum with the Pope under the canopy, I guess with a computer screen that I hadn't noticed. And I saw a bit of this service yesterday live from Italy, and especially moving was this uh, scene of an Ukrainian and a Russian woman that know each other, I think from nursing training, and they're together with the cross at the 13th station of the cross. And they look like, I thought they looked like identical twins. Incredible. And it's a symbol of the Pope's desire, Pope Francis' desire for brotherhood, sisterhood between these warring peoples, and especially as a sign against the aggression by Russia against Ukraine, the taking up of arms and bombing hospitals and all that. And then I see people on Facebook, and so I'm kind of rambling, I hope, with a method to my madness, thoughts that come to me in these unprepared talks. I see people on Facebook, especially some of my Italian friends, who I consider to be just incredibly enraged people. And they're enraged primarily in some of these cases, and one in particular, against themselves. They have in some ways screwed up their lives. They have a lot of studies, nice degrees, didn't do much with them, have other personal vicissitudes in their lives. And you can tell they're angry, angry people, ready to spurt their anger. And I'm a firm believer, as a kind of a Freudian type, that anger is one of the prime motivators, and we know that the media likes to foment anger because anger engages you, it energizes you, the adrenaline, etc., the fight or flight response. But anger seeks a target. And when anger is not externalized, focused on an outside target, it turns inward as depression or self-destruction. I'm reading. I just read. Took a break from reading the biography of Anne Sexton. As you can tell, I'm on a roll with biographies of poets, and it just so happens that most of them committed suicide. But Anne Sexton was self-destructive, very passionate, and also very angry against herself, and she knew that. And on her birthday, the symbol of her coming into life, she would tend to punish herself. And what I just read now, I think we're in the year 1966, she died in 74. She falls down the stairs, completely down the stairs on her birthday, November 9th, and breaks her hip. And so that's a case of anger turned inward. But what we have in many cases is anger turned outward. And in this particular Italian case, I don't understand exactly what this person is for or against, but this person distrusts her government completely and doesn't buy anything regarding this Russian aggression. You wonder if she likes Putin. I don't think this person likes Trump, but I don't know whether she likes authoritarians or not, or she just wants to be against what the majority is for. People have rallied behind Ukraine against Russia, and there are people that the naysayers, sometimes a naysayer can be a real prophet, but sometimes a naysayer is somebody who will say nay to anybody that says yay. You know, they just want to contradict. It's a way of establishing your power or something. I don't know, but it's very messy and very confusing, and that's why we the collective, we keep shooting ourselves in the foot, and we don't make progress. We're a totally divided nation, and a lot of it has to do with uh, no spirit of common ground or cooperation or calmly philosophizing. I'm reading Seneca, so I'm a little bit imbued with the what I learned in philosophy over many, many years, which is basically what I'm trying to do here to cultivate and foment thinking, reflection, study. I guess I lost my train of thought when I talked about the bishops and their formation. What happened then is that these bishops are invited to Vatican II by Pope John the 23rd, and you have had brewing in the church for decades biblical and patristic and historical scholarship, of which the Dominicans were foremost, along with the Jesuits. The Dominicans of Les Sauchois and the Jesuits of Fourvière, Lyon, etc. Biblical studies had begun with modern Catholic biblical studies had begun with Father Marie Joseph Lagrange, not Garrigou Lagrange, different story. Mary Joseph Lagrange had begun modern Catholic biblical studies. They had been legitimized after his death by Pope Pius XII in the encyclical of 1943, Divino Afflante Spiritu. And Congar had been working on church history, ecumenism, etc. You had some Americans working on pluralism and things like that. And what was striking to me reading about this stuff, which I devoted a lot of time to in recent years, after knowing about Vatican II for almost 50 years, was the incredible enthusiasm of the bishops, learning that there was a whole universe of history and of the way things had been done, which these scholars had been studying and excavating and sharing, which had not been contained in those little theology manuals. They thought that there was only one way to do something. And now you have these conferences all over Rome talking about history, the fathers, different views, different councils, different situations, different historical circumstances, different developments, etc. It's like evolution and dynamics rather than Everything is stationary and narrow. And most people love things that are stationary and narrow. At my age, I don't want any changes around here. But you can't apply or you can't just fulfill your need for stationary and narrow so that you don't, trouble your little mind. I used to use the example with my seminarians. You have a nice little house for yourself and your wife, maybe, and then you have a child or two or three or maybe five children or more, and you need to expand your house. Well, breaking down those walls and rebuilding and the dust and the time and all that kind of stuff is incredibly unpleasant, but it has to be done. And then you have a more livable house for yourself and your growing family. So that I think that exploring these worlds is part of what we need to do to be fully Homo sapiens and fully try to, or more effectively grapple with the overwhelming and very uncomfortable changes that we have in society. This applies to all groups because the tendency towards oversimplification and self-excusing and blaming others applies to left and right, applies to all kinds of groups, minorities or majorities or whatever. This is all non-philosophical thinking, meaning this is thinking that doesn't love wisdom. It loves to divert stress from your mind and maybe absolve you of responsibility and absolve you of the challenge to make efforts and to change. And you blame someone else, and now you have sort of gotten rid of the hot potato, so to speak. And so, as I read Seneca, not that I agree with the Stoics 100% or anything, but I do go back to what I think is common ground for any thinking, really thinking person. All the philosophers, I think, agree, even Epicurus, who, people say he's an Epicurean, he likes to eat a lot or something, but, or even the hedonists, um, even when you want to maximize pleasure and you believe only in pleasure, you do that philosophically in a very moderate, disciplined way, because the desire for immediate gratification of pleasure desires thwarts itself. You overeat, you get sick. You overdrink, you get sick. And you can go down the list. So what the philosophers agree with is what basically I think Christianity, Judaism, Islam, I think almost any religion is going to preach peace. I'm not sure that every religion preaches that, but peace and simplicity, respect for the planet, suspicious against greed, your own greed and your own immoderate desires. There would be tremendous agreement if people, even without believing in God, were philosophers, lovers of wisdom. And that's one of the things I try to contribute to in these talks. And then I wanted to get to another example in a second. But today is not only Holy Saturday, it happens to be the 16th of April, which is one of my favorite days for the feast of two saints who both died at the age of 35, who both died April 16th, about 100 years apart. They both were French. They both were uneducated. The first is this Benoit Joseph Labre, who was a misfit. He was unsuccessful. I didn't know I was going to connect this to the Dominicans a little later. So the Holy Spirit, I blame him for some of these talks. He was unsuccessful trying out for religious life. And even though he was from a middle class family, he was clean, personally clean and orderly, he resolved in one of these things that happen in the world to go out on pilgrimage constantly from one place to the other, Loreto, maybe Santiago Compostela, I think he made it there, some other places, and finally settled in Rome, where it is said he slept at the fifth station of the cross in the Colosseum. I didn't know I was going to talk about this. And he was in the Rione, the neighborhood of Rome called Monti, because of the Church of Our Lady of the Mountains. I lived for about a year very close to this church, very close. So I would visit, and his tomb is there. He would pray there for hours, tattered, a lay person, no power, no anything. And he collapsed there on a day like today. He was taken to, I guess, the butcher's, apartment next door, which is open once a year. And I went at least twice to this place. But he was a humble man, I guess the saint of the homeless nowadays, the saint of the misfits, the saints of those who suffer alone but leave an example for others. It is said that when he collapsed and died and the word spread, the bells rang, and the little children would run across these streets that I know so well. In fact, there's a Russian or Ukrainian center right in that piazza, a small piazza at the end of Via Panisperna, right in that Via dei Serpenti where he died, the way of the serpents, that I walked all over. That's right near the Colosseum, so that's within, you can look at the Colosseum right there and walk, a few yards maybe and get to the Colosseum. So the little children would run around the neighborhood saying, "The saint is dead, the saint is dead." Because simply by, he wasn't a preacher or anything, simply by praying for hours in this great humility, I guess at the back of this church, it's a small church, Santa Maria dei Monti, he caused a big impression. I bought a facsimile of the biography of this saint by the priest, who said that the priest would break down in tears hearing his confession. In other words, this is like the opposite of Anne Sexton in a way. This is a suffering man who clung to God. Who knows what other things were in his head, but he made a tremendous impact on this priest who wrote this biography. We're talking about the 1700s. So what I have are these reprints they make in India, and you can get them and see it. It's like a photocopy of, the old printed book at a reasonable price. And it just so happens that today is also the feast of Saint Bernadette Soubirous, the Lourdes visionary who saw the Virgin, to whom I am very, very devoted, as I am to Benoit or Benedict Joseph Labre. But Bernadette is very special, very ignorant, uh, but very savvy. And this is a very interesting picture of her. It shows her in all her peasant savvy, not trying to look like a saint or anything. And this is another one from the cover of a book, more attractive, but still not your typical, saint, as for example, Benedict would have been painted in this, more stylized, iconic representation of saints. So it's a very special day, and 11 years ago in Rome in 2011, I was able to go to Mass in the morning at Santa Maria in Aquiro, where they say they have the oldest painting of Bernadette and Lourdes. Looks very modern, but it's supposed to be the oldest. And I used to pray there a long time. So I went to Mass there in the morning. Then I ran over from the Pantheon area. I must have taken a bus. Maybe I could walk. Via dei Serpenti, and go to the home of, or the place where Benedict Joseph Labre died, where they celebrate Mass in the room where he died, where they have his, relics, his clothes, and maybe a book or something, on display. And so I got to celebrate both these saints. The third thing I wanted to talk about, and again, I didn't really prepare it very much, is I wanted to talk about Saint Dominic, because I am reading a life that I've been wanting to read for a long time. In French that I'm reading, and it's an incredible journey back in my life to when I was a Dominican. I'm reading Vicair's life of Dominic, the life of Saint Dominic, and he's talking with as much historical information as he has been able to gather. This is a book from 1956, highly annotated. The notes are, quotes in Latin and things like that, and some expressions from the south of France, which are not, French really, Occitan or something like that. Not so far from Bernadette country, by the way. And I get very nostalgic thinking about this preacher and reading, especially the last few pages that I read this morning, how he turned down bishoprics. He was offered to be a bishop at least once, maybe two, maybe even more times. And he said, no, the preacher, and he was about to found the order of preachers, Dominicans, where I spent, let's say, several years training to be one. I didn't make it. A little bit like Benedict Joseph Labre. The preacher has to devote himself to preaching. He becomes a priest to exercise this priestly function of preaching, but is not primarily meant to administer sacraments, just like Paul. Paul says, I didn't baptize anybody. Okay, I did baptize that guy, but maybe some other guy too, but that's about it. Not necessarily, running churches unless you have to. Not being involved in judicial things until later with the Inquisition. The Dominicans got, involved in that. But Dominic wanted to be free, didn't want to be a bishop correcting clergymen. That was one of the main functions of bishops, were administering properties and disciplining the clergy, which were left a lot to be desired in many ways. That's why Francis and Dominic are great reformers of the church, and especially of the clergy, indirectly anyway, by being model religious and clergymen, priests. And poverty and detachment from interest, financial or power, was a sine qua non, an indispensable condition without which you cannot be free. Because you are thinking, just like a doctor who has it in his head, I have to do 10 operations a week to make this amount of money. Guess what happens when that ninth guy or whatever it is comes in and he's a borderline case of whether to be operated or not, which is a heavy thing? Well, a lot of doctors will err on the side of their profit. Now, that's to me a huge crime. I got fired from a job as a lawyer once when I was all ready to try a case involving a black young man who had been accused of brandishing a weapon, as I recall. Which, when I studied the case, I said, I, as a lawyer, can give this man a good defense because I have studied it, and I think that the facts are in such dispute that under our legal system, if there is a reasonable doubt, and there was, some lawyers defend anybody, but in my case, I looked at it and I said, all I need as a beginning lawyer is help from my boss, who's supposed to be coming around, helping me choose a jury or getting me, kind of prime my pump. And then I can do my job because I'm still learning some of these things. Well, my boss came around. His interest was not this young man or even me. His interest was his business and his time to make more money. So he railroaded the young man into a plea deal, which the young man, even with two lawyers in front of him and his mother, I think, was there. He's being railroaded. He doesn't have a lot of strength or personality or force of character to contradict the lawyer and all that. So he knew he was being pushed, and he was not happy. And it happened that way. It went down that way. I couldn't do much more about it except what I did do, which was a little later. I couldn't help but talk about this to people I shouldn't have, like court reporters who work for lawyers. And word got back to my boss, and guess what? I was no longer working there after that. So I lost my job by protesting. And my example was, if you're selling Milky Way bars or something and you happen to sell a lot of candy and people eat candy and get a cavity, you're not maybe doing a great job, but that's not so bad. If you're a doctor or a lawyer and you are working for your own greed instead of the good of the patient or the client, the consequences of your selfishness can be very serious and your acts can be criminal. And so, again, Dominic and Francis made sure that they gave an example of detachment and poverty. And in fact, in the case of Dominic, it was really required, probably also in the case of Francis. I read about Francis every morning too. But in the case of Dominic, he was up against the Cathars, the Albigensians, these dualistic heretics who were, especially the perfect ones, so called, very poor, detached, etc. And the people admired those more than the Catholic clergy, who were seen as lax, corrupt, lazy, comfortable, self interested, no edifying example. So Dominic had to outdo the heretics, not only in doctrine and learning, but in the example of his life. And so when I read this, I do get incredibly, well, I do get very nostalgic for the people I met in the Dominican order, in Mexico especially. Our provincial, in fact, was French, Father Desaubry, a personage, a great personage, friend of Pope Paul VI. He had been the prior of Congar in, I think, the convent of the Annunciation, L'Annonciation, which I may have visited in Faubourg Saint-Honoré, because then Congar went to Saint Jacques, the successor convent of a very famous convent in the Rue de Tannerie. I'm pronouncing that right, and that's where I met him and had lunch with Yves Congar. But the provincial was French. Other great personages were there. My formators, my teachers had been trained in France, many of them. Some at the École Biblique in Jerusalem, some at Les Auchois, some in Canada with Tillard, the great religious life thinker, etc., ecclesiologist in Canada. And I tasted all this Dominicanism, and I guess even a saint like Benedict Joseph, with all his desire and goodwill, did not have maybe the hardware, maybe the software to be a Cistercian or whatever other clerical or religious life he naturally desired, and he had to settle for a very unique calling, a calling that few, maybe, the Russian pilgrim, maybe. I mean, he basically lived a very hard life in great, even filth. I said he was from a middle class, clean family, and he was personally clean. But if you're on the road all day, if you have nowhere to sleep, if you sleep at the fifth station of the cross, you don't have the hygiene that you desired. And he did this for Christ. There was a little, maybe, Jansenism there in the background where, animals and insects and fleas or lice and all this kind of stuff is part of your penance, like a hair shirt, or some of these other, saints. Heinrich Suso, Henry Suso would flagellate himself to exaggeration, although all the saints did that. Dominic did that. St. Martin de Porres did that. So we have all kinds of things in the church that have been done. I don't think Mother Teresa did that. Her penance was working in Calcutta with people dying in the street. I don't think Edith Stein did any of that. Teresa of Lisieux, I don't think, was big on that. Maybe once in a while. I mean, you know, uh, flagellation. The discipline, they called it the discipline, or to wear a chilichium or some sort of penitential uh, object on your body. That was very common, and some people want to revive that now. But I think today we focus more on on the need for peace and helping the poor. I have my dreamer shirt on. This is the community of Sant'Egidio's project in Africa for AIDS, etc. So that in some reflections on Holy Saturday, different callings, it's always a calling towards peace and friendship, trying to set a good example, trying to seek God, to cling to God. I'm reading Seneca, and Seneca talks of philosophy in terms of clinging to philosophy. Well, Christians would cling to Christ, as these two women in the 13th station yesterday of the Via Crucis, the way of the cross, clung to this cross together. They looked like identical twins from two nations at war, one of the nations being an aggressor, which is why some people criticize the idea or criticize the Pope. I mean, that's another thing, if you can find something to criticize the Pope with, some people love to do that. Because the Pope, I think, like Jesus, touches a lot of sore spots. And you have a mass of enraged people. I'm going back to the beginning of my talk as I approached its end. A mass of enraged energy. You can channel it against the targets that you see fit. And normally, the puppeteers are targeting those who represent a problem for their greed. I'll say it just like that. What part don't we understand? God and money, the two competitors. And the way things are structured now, I just got a new modem and I'm going to get a new SIM card for a cheaper phone service. And you become aware of how all these internet things are connected and all the various devices that appear that shouldn't appear and all this kind of stuff. It's a very complicated thing, but algorithms, all this stuff, Facebook, all this, but it's all organized for advertising, mind control, profits. And even if Jeff Zuckerberg begins just being a geek, whatever you call it, a nerd, with his computers, and he wants to have a Facebook or with to get girls or dates or something. Once that company becomes public, and now you've got these measurements, value of stock, power, readership, subscribers, blah blah blah. Then that becomes your idol. That becomes your focus. You evolve or devolve. You get worse from what you started out doing, which was getting people together and stuff like that. And now you're obsessed with, am I bigger? Am I losing? Am I gaining? All a numbers game. And with horrible consequences. They flirted with, not more than flirt. I think they've consummated unions with fake news sources, even Russian sources that had a lot to do with the election. Once you sow distrust on the electoral process, where the vanguard, the Marines of the enraged, the guys that assaulted Capitol Hill, and I say that in a bad way, Marines in a bad way, they assaulted Capitol Hill to overturn an election, pressuring Mike Pence, pressuring the Congress, physically stupid, but that's the level they operate. They think that not only they operate at, but that much of America operates at. And I was flipped, like I said before, I flipped through the channels. I see Fox News. They're talking about the invasion from Central America or Mexico. They're diverting the focus from the capital of the United States to these poor, immigrants, trying to get into this country where they have problems filling a lot of jobs today. But you can make white black and white and black white and red green and yellow blue because you are the puppeteers. And I am trying to put in my 2 cents on thinking, philosophy, love of wisdom, and the example of real people who, in a sense, put their money where their mouth was. And I can say with some degree of pride that I have spoken out at some points in ways that have cost me my jobs, more than one job, including in the church. And so I don't feel bad about that. I would be much unhappier if I had sold myself. We kind of sell ourselves in some ways, almost inevitably. But as far as principles are concerned, and clarity and honesty and the truth, even the truth that reflects badly on you, that to me, I somewhere along the line I learned that, or maybe with the Dominicans, maybe with my father, maybe with my mother. Uh, I've learned that it's much worse to sell yourself than to keep your soul as intact as you can. And with those words, I will stop my little Holy Saturday reflection